Welcome to the Purpose Nation podcast, inspiring conversations with Christians in science, technology, and industries of the future. For more information or to make a tax-deductible contribution, visit purposenation.org.
This is Brad Cooper with Purpose Nation, and on the podcast today, have you ever thought of bringing a little bit of the sun, that very bright and hot star in our solar system, maybe just bring a little piece of that right down here on Earth so we could kind of use it and get energy from it, or maybe bottling up some lightning or something like that? You probably don't think about that very often, but our next guest actually has spent a lot of time thinking about doing just that, and along with a lot of other very important thoughts and work in science and in faith. And so I'm very honored and blessed to welcome my guest on the podcast, Professor Ian Hutchinson. Professor Hutchinson, welcome to the Purpose Nation podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
Likewise. Thank you for being here. And I do also have to say he is so gracious in that we've actually talked before and we had a little bit of a technical glitch, a little bit of human error on my side. And so he's so gracious for spending time with us again and talking with us again. My description of bringing your work, in your work and bringing the sun to Earth probably scared people and didn't quite do it justice. So real quickly, in layperson's terms, how would you describe that body of work that you do, and what is it? What can it do for us?
Yeah, what I do is I study plasmas. Those are very, very hot gases in which the electrons are stripped from the ions, and they have important electrical properties. And the long-term purpose of this research, or at least one major purpose, is to enable us to use fusion energy, which is the energy source of the sun and stars, on the human scale to try to generate useful energy. This has been a long-term research project over 60 or more years, more than my career, and I spent most of my career on it. That's basically what I do. I'm a plasma physicist, and I am a professor of nuclear science and engineering at MIT.
And when we talk about energy specifically, and we talk about nuclear energy in particular, some might confuse fusion, which is, I think, what you focus on, with fission, which is very different. But what are the differences between those two?
Yeah, so fusion refers to the reacting together of two nuclei, typically two isotopes of hydrogen. And when you do that, it releases energy. So these are light ions, light nuclei. There are also heavy nuclei like uranium, and if you break those up, it turns out that also releases energy, and that breakage of the uranium nucleus, or fission as it's called, of the uranium nucleus, is what gives us the nuclear energy that we currently have. And the potential advantages of fusion are that it has more abundant resources, it has greater safety potentially, and it has other attractive features. But it's much more difficult to make it happen in a controlled way on Earth. And that's what we've been trying to find out how to do.
Well, that's great. I'm really looking forward to having like a bit of the sun in like my backyard, so I could just power up the house and charge the car and stuff like that sometime.
Yeah, probably not in your backyard, but...
Well, as Professor Hutchinson said, he's a nuclear engineer and physicist, and he's, as he said, currently professor of nuclear science and engineering at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, not so shabby a place to do science and technology. He has a bachelor's in physics and a master's from Cambridge University, and got his PhD in engineering at Australian National University. He's received many awards and honors in this field, and so many very important contributions in the field of nuclear engineering and physics. But he's also written a lot and spoken a lot about faith and science and the combination of the two, and where there's different issues there. And so he's been a speaker at conferences and forums like the Veritas Forum, which is usually held on college campuses, and where the speakers get to interact a lot with the audience and especially students who may be there. And he has a lot of questions that he receives at those talks. And he's written a new book coming out of those questions called "Can a Scientist Believe in Miracles?" An MIT professor answers questions on God and science. And so along with that book, he's written also a lot of just scientific papers, books on science and faith. And I understand he also enjoys hiking, fly fishing, and a bit of squash. Is that right? Squash is a tough sport. I commend you for that. It seems
it's very energetic, and I intend to keep playing it as long as I can. So it's great for fitness.
Yeah, and I don't plan to join you anytime soon. You would destroy me. It's been a long time since I've played. I also understand. Yeah, you're a bit of a singer as well. So is it baritone, tenor?
Yeah, I sing both baritone and tenor, and in different choruses. I've got a couple of performances. Haydn's Teresa Mass coming up in a month's time, and a few other things. So I really enjoy singing, and it's part of my interests and activities and hobbies.
That's awesome. But again, you won't find me joining me in your chorus anytime soon. They'd have the big hook that comes out and grabs me to take me off the stage. That's awesome. So just real quick about your newest book. Did I get that right? It seemed like it spawned out of a lot of these different forums that you do and the questions you receive from those audiences. Is that right?
Yeah, it's literally based on the questions I've been asked at Veritas forums, many of which have been video recorded, so I can actually access the literal questions that I've been asked. And because those questions are in many ways the most interesting things, and the question time is the most interesting time in these forums, it seemed to me to make sense to make that a sort of motivation and content of my book. So although Can a Scientist Believe in Miracles is just one of those questions, one of over 200 questions that I address, it's also a very important question that has consequences for the Christian faith generally. So the book is all about the questions that young people, mostly in universities, ask about the relationship between science and Christianity.
And it sounds like you also, obviously you answered the question, and maybe in some cases you didn't, at the forums themselves. But it sounds like you also had some time to go back and think a little bit and kind of come on, because I know on those things, and I've done some of these speaking engagements too, and some of the questions may come out of left field. It's like, and you kind of maybe stumble on some of them. But it sounds like you went back and even put some more thought in some of the answers.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that I don't stand by the answers I gave at the time. I do. But in general, when you're speaking live to an audience, you have to limit the amount of answer you give, sometimes to quite interesting and deep questions. And so those questions, in a certain sense, sent me back to say, well, okay, let's think about this topic harder and give a more sustained and deeper probing type of answer to this question. And the book gathers similar questions together and into different topics. And so that gives it some kind of good continuity. And it's actually, the questions are very wide ranging. I mean, many of them are about science or the relationship of science to the Bible or to other aspects of life or of faith. But some of them have very little to do with science, but nevertheless, they're the kind of questions that come up.
That's great. And I definitely recommend the book, and I want to talk more about that. A lot of great questions and answers in there, a great resource for you if you're looking for, some answers from a pretty smart guy. So I definitely want to talk more about that and specifically get into some of those questions. Before I do, I also want to take a little step back and just kind of tell folks how you got into all of this. It's not every day, the kid kind of wakes up and says, I want to be a nuclear physicist and engineer and work on, plasma physics. So take us back a little bit and sort of what point in your life did you decide, whether it was a kid or maybe later on, that you wanted to go into science and more specifically engineering and physics?
Well, when I was in middle school or early high school, I thought I wanted to be a lawyer. And I was studying the classics and various other things, which I thought would be good for that. But that was before I took my first course in physics, which immediately attracted me immensely compared with these other topics. And I had an excellent physics teacher who was exciting and interesting and fun, and I that just totally changed my life. I realized I wanted to be into physics and mathematics, that I was more talented at those, and that's how I got interested in science in general. I went to Cambridge University, and so I was studying physics and math there were my majors, and that's really how I grew into the field that I'm currently and have been working in for most of my career. I didn't set out specifically to go into that field, but I would say, generally speaking, it was the fascination of finding out about the world in a deep way that drew me into science.
So, for all you teachers and educators out there, I don't know if you caught that, but that was sort of one of the turning points, at least. And I'm sure God played a role as well in guiding you where he wanted you to be. But, the importance of sounded like you had a great physics teacher in high school. So there you go. All you educators and teachers out there, see what your students can become if you can inspire them and have great physics lessons in high school. And then how about in terms of your faith background and your Christian background? Were you raised in a Christian family? Kind of how did you become a Christian?
No, I wasn't raised in a Christian family. My family didn't go to church except really for weddings. And so there wasn't really any faith commitment within my family background. The school I went to for middle and high school had a nominal association with the Christian church and had prayers in assembly and that kind of thing. But I was therefore not totally ignorant of Christianity. It wasn't something that attracted me. It wasn't something I believed in, and I just took it as part of the background of my experience in high school. So it really wasn't until I went to Cambridge that I began to take Christianity more seriously. And the main reason that I did that was that I had two close student friends who were people I enjoyed. They were fun, they were smart, and they had attractive lives. And both of them were Christians. So that perhaps made me think much more deeply about the Christianity having some relevance possibly for my life. Later on, the second year of my time at Cambridge, they invited me to go to a series of lectures given by Michael Green, who was a well-known Christian speaker at the time in England. And much to their surprise, I said yes. And I went to those lectures, and I was struck by two important new ideas that I hadn't gained from the Christian background that I had from my school. One was that actually the evidence for the truth of Christianity, particularly of the resurrection of Jesus, was actually rather good, the historical evidence for it. And secondly, that Christianity is not so much an intellectual assent to some kind of propositions, but it's actually a call to a personal relationship with God. And those two facts seemed to me to be new ideas that I hadn't thought about before. And I began to realize that I actually did more or less believe that there was truth in Christianity, that Jesus was who he said he was. But I realized also that if I was going to go further with this, it was going to require me to make a step of personal commitment that would change my life. And eventually I came to the point where I said, yes, I'm not 100% certain of the truth of Christianity, but I want to take that step of commitment. And I did, and I knelt and prayed a prayer of commitment to Christ, and I've been his follower ever since.
So you had already been kind of in a little bit into the science culture, and I mean, was there any change? I mean, obviously, you had Christian friends, so it probably wasn't a whole lot of change there. And then just ongoing in your career, I hear different things from different folks I have on the podcast.
In the long term, there were many changes in my life, but it didn't suddenly change the studies that I was doing or anything like that. And I found myself drawn into fellowship with other Christians. I didn't know much about Christianity, even though I had studied it at school. I knew some of the New Testament, but I certainly didn't know how it applied to my life. And so, in a certain sense, my Christian faith and my science grew up together through that undergraduate experience and on into graduate studies in Australia.
Great. And so you've also kind of been very vocal and outspoken about your faith. Some scientists kind of prefer to keep it a little closer to the vest and not talk a lot about their faith. I mean, how would you describe sort of the relationship with your peers in your scientific endeavors? Have they been mostly supportive? Have you had people have questions? I mean, how would you characterize your interaction with other peers?
Well, I think most of the people that I've ever worked with know that I'm a Christian. And as you say, I'm fairly open about that. That was a determination that I made sort of early on in my Christian career. I took seriously the words of Jesus, who said that those who are ashamed of me, I'll be ashamed of. And I didn't want him to be ashamed of me, so I decided I wasn't going to be ashamed of Christ. On occasions, people have been surprised by my Christian faith and asked me questions like, well, how could a smart guy like you believe all that kind of stuff? And that's an interesting opportunity to talk about the fact that I don't find Christianity to be implausible or in any sense inconsistent with my science. In fact, I think there's some deep resonances and consistencies there. And there have been occasions on which people have talked me down behind my back, but in general, I don't think I've suffered any direct persecution from the administration of the institutes that I belong to. Among my scientific colleagues, I find quite a substantial number of people who are also followers of Jesus. So I think that while people often think that there are very few scientists who are Christians, it actually isn't the case. If you do demographic studies of American universities and you ask, well, amongst the professors, is it the scientists that are mostly secular, or is it people in other fields? The answer is scientists are in many cases, the least likely to be unbelievers. In other words, they're the most likely to believe in Jesus because they don't find any conflict between walking by faith and practicing the Christian life and the practice of science.
Amen to that. Yeah, absolutely. And we obviously have a lot of them on the podcast as well. So going forward a little bit in terms of your work again as a scientist, tell us a little bit more about that. And so what, and I hope if I'm pronouncing this correctly, but what is a tokamak? Is that how you pronounce that?
That's pretty good. Yeah, that's good.
Why would we build such a thing?
So a tokamak is a toroidal device that confines plasma, these incredibly hot gases. These plasmas are hotter, actually, than the center of the sun. They can be as much as 100 million degrees Celsius.
Wow.
And if you have something that's hot, that is that hot, you can't just put it in a regular material bottle and hope that you're going to keep it there because it would instantly melt the bottle or else it would cool off. So we have to confine it using immaterial forces. And the creators' fusion reactors, which are the stars, are held together by gravity, which is an immaterial force. But in order to hold something together on a much smaller scale, gravity is too weak because the gravity between small objects is rather small. So what instead we do is we use magnetic fields to confine the plasma, and we fashion these into a donut shape, which is what a torus is. And the magnetic fields act to hold in the plasma and isolate it from the walls of the vacuum vessel in which it sits. And the whole challenge of fusion is, can we hold this plasma together well enough, isolated from the walls for long enough times so that the fusion reactions can take place and maintain the plasma hot enough?
That's amazing. And it seems like almost an impossible feat of engineering. It just seems so complex and incredible. Where are we in terms of the progress? I understand there may be this experiment in France, but where are we in terms of the stage of where this might someday be a source of energy on the grid for us?
Well, yes, it's tough, but we've been pursuing this for some decades. And as a result of the experiments, including the experiments that we've done here at MIT and in my group with very serious smaller scale experiments, we now think that we know how to build and are in the process of building in the south of France a multi-nation collaboration that is an experiment. If successful, it will demonstrate controlled fusion reactions at the level of several hundred megawatts of power of reactions for hundreds of seconds at a time. And that will be a scientific demonstration of magnetically confined controlled fusion reaction. It won't put energy on the grid because it's an experiment. It's not designed as a power reactor. And there will be substantial amount of engineering beyond what has been done for this experiment in order to make it run round the clock and routinely generate energy. So it won't immediately hail a new era of fusion energy, but I think it will be an important step towards the long-term deployment of fusion energy for human scale.
So when just a few years back when they turned on the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, everyone was worried it's like going to create like a black hole or something. It's going to open up in the center of the Earth and swallow us all up or something like that. No concerns about black holes with this, right?
No, the experiment that's being built in France is actually somewhat bigger in overall scale than the Large Hadron Collider.
Right.
But one of the attractions of fusion is that it doesn't have such serious risks of meltdown or other accidents as is potentially exist for our current nuclear energy. And so really it'll be quite safe. The amount of energy involved in the fusing plasma is relatively small, so it's not liable to cause any kind of danger to humankind. And so that safety is one of the selling points of fusion energy.
Prayers for you and the teams that are putting this together. And what are your thoughts on, when we might see this on the grid? Is this something we might see in our lifetimes by the end of the century? What are your thoughts on how close we may be?
Well, one of the problems with this experiment is that it's very big and it takes a long time to build because it's complicated. And in fact, it won't come into operation. Even the experiment won't come into operation until I'm well and truly retired from my professional career. So that was one of the disappointments in my life. Certainly when I began doing fusion research, I hoped that we would have fusion energy in my lifetime. I don't now think we will. Nevertheless, I think it's an important scientific study and has potential for the future.
Absolutely. Well, now talking again about your book, and again, we're talking with Professor Ian Hutchinson about his work and his faith and the book that he has, which is really, really great resource. I definitely recommend it. We will have a link to the book in our podcast page, so you can go check it out and get it from wherever you get your books. But the book is called Can a Scientist Believe in Miracles? An MIT professor answers questions on God and science. So what sort of prompted you to put these together and to write it, and what did you hope to accomplish with it, or what did you hope folks would get from it?
Well, there are really two sides to my motivation, both for this book and for the great amount of speaking that I do mostly to university audiences about the relationship between science and Christianity. One is to help inform Christians about science and help them to understand better the relationship between science and their Christian faith. But the other is to appeal also to skeptics or seekers, people who are unbelievers, and to help them to recognize that there is a far more constructive relationship between science and Christianity than is often portrayed both by skeptics and by Christians. In fact, it is the case that Christianity grew up in science grew up in what amounted to a fertile environment which was largely provided by the Christian faith and by the biblical worldview. And so far from Christianity and being a drag on science, on holding back science, some people have said for hundreds of years, it seems to me that history is in fact telling us the opposite. And this is evidenced by the fact that, a large fraction of the greatest scientists of history were in fact Christian believers. So the myth that has been promoted for the past maybe 150 years that somehow science and Christianity are completely incompatible is just untrue, and we need to get past that. We need to understand both Christianity and science better in order to realize that there's a much more constructive relationship between them than that.
Yeah, and so what would you say is there's probably a lot of them, but what was one or two of the most common questions you get at these forums, would you say?
Well, the most common questions include particularly questions, for example, about the Bible and science. And those types of questions come from both of the audiences that I've referred to. They come from Christians trying to understand the extent to which their understanding of the Bible is consistent with discoveries of modern science. But they also come from skeptics, sometimes quite militant skeptics, who think that asking questions about the relationship between the Bible and science reveals the weakness of Christianity. I think there are some weaknesses in some interpretations of the Bible, and these are things that one should think deeply about. But in most cases, those apparent contradictions are contradictions with certain types of interpretation of the Bible. So to take an historical example, when there was controversy about whether the earth orbits the sun or the sun orbits the earth, this is the famous activities and controversy surrounding the life of Galileo, some people in the church, some ministers in the church, would point to the Psalms and say, here it says in the Psalms that the earth is firmly established and can never be moved. And that proves that the earth cannot orbit the sun. Well, that was a misinterpretation of the Psalms. The Psalms were giving a poetic emphasis and declaration of the security of the earth and the power of God in establishing it. It wasn't meant to say that we should come to that and interpret it as some kind of scientific claim about what body orbits another. And so these days, essentially nobody believes that the sun orbits the earth, and they all believe that the earth orbits the sun, and we've reinterpreted or changed our interpretation of that psalm. Well, there are some other aspects of the Bible that are often problematic if you take certain types of interpretation of them. So I think the most important thing in trying to understand the relationship between science and the Bible is to recognize that even though the Bible has lots of different types of literature, it has history, it has biography, it has letters, it has poetry, it has liturgy, and so on and so forth. The one type of literature the Bible does not contain is scientific literature as we understand it today. And so it is a mistake if Christians go to the Bible expecting to be able to read scientific interpretations into it.
Mm-hmm.
That is not the way, in my view, that we should most fruitfully approach the Bible. And so there are many specific questions in my book that are addressed, but that's the underlying principle that I find to be most valuable. I take the Bible very seriously. I take seriously and would affirm the notion that it is inspired by God and profitable for teaching, reproof, and correction, as it says in 2 Timothy 3:16. But that doesn't mean that when we come to it, our particular interpretations are always affirmed by God.
Mm-hmm.
The Bible is a book that requires us to read it. Like every other literature, interpretation is part of that process of reading it.
And the questions you get that you go through in your book, would you say there's differences in just different parts of the country here, even in the United States? So I imagine Boston might have a different set of questions, even from Christians maybe, than the Bible Belt or something like that. I don't know if how much you've been outside of sort of the academic kind of areas, but are there differences just in terms of the questions that get fielded in different parts of the country even?
I'm not sure that there are such great differences,
okay.
but of course, I'm mostly speaking to university audiences, and so perhaps the questions that come to their mind are more uniform across the country. It's certainly the case that in different areas of the country, Christianity has broader or narrower appeal to the people who live there. But I think within the university, these kinds of intellectual challenges that people have are relatively common across the nation. There are questions that are more fraught, I think, in America as a whole, and perhaps these are questions which also have regional variations. So I'm thinking of things like people are more troubled by the relationship between evolution, for example, the scientific theory of evolution, and how does that fit with the biblical story and those
right.
types of questions.
Right.
In my travel to other countries, and I've lived in Australia and England as well as in America, I find that particular question is less problematic in those other countries than it is in the US, and that's partly because of American history and famous and high-profile trials and arguments and so forth that influence the culture at large.
Yeah, and what would you say? Was there any questions that stump you, or have stumped you, or maybe were difficult to answer? What were one or two of the questions that are most difficult for you?
Well, there are many questions that remain difficult. Actually, most of them are theological questions rather than scientific questions. But I think that one of the toughest questions that Christians as a whole face is, how can God be all-powerful and all-benevolent, and yet good people suffer? And so it's the problem of pain or of theodicy. I think that question is one where there are no simple answers. And if people are suffering, there really isn't a theological way that we can comfort them or explain that situation to them. All we can do, I think, or all we should do in those fraught and difficult types of situations is be alongside the person. And that's the whole meaning of the word compassion, is in a certain sense to suffer with them. And I think that the only sense in which there is a theological comfort for them is when we realize that God himself, in the person of his Son, has practiced precisely that compassion, precisely that suffering with us. And that's part of what it means to say that Jesus came and suffered and died for our sins. So I think that God practices, in a certain sense, that compassion towards people who suffer. But the intellectual question of, well, how could it possibly be that suffering exists and yet there is an omnipotent and omnibenevolent God? I think that actually does have some fairly good theological answers, but those answers aren't of any comfort to people who are in a place of suffering.
Right. And do you think that just Christians in the audiences you speak to, how in terms of you being a scientist and obviously know your stuff and also know quite a bit about theology as well, but just in terms of, their reception to scientists and science in general, especially again here in America, as you said, a little bit of a different perception. Is part of this just maybe some mistrust of the scientists they see on the television? Sometimes a lot of the spokespeople, Richard Dawkins and all these other folks are what we would call the new atheists, kind of aggressively, as you said, sort of somewhat militant against Christians. Or do you get more respect because you're a scientist? How would you describe that in terms of how people at these audiences view you as a professional scientist and also a Christian versus a pastor in their church in terms of how they receive this information and the questions they ask?
Well, I think science generally has very high respect in our modern society, and it deserves it in a certain sense. Science has been tremendously successful in finding out about the world, and the technologies that it has spawned are extremely powerful and in many cases helpful.
Right.
So it's not surprising that scientists generally have high respect. But the problem is that in many cases, scientists, particularly those who are anti-theistic in their views, use that to essentially appeal for the things that they believe in. And so when the anti-theists like Dawkins and his ilk speak and claim that science disproves religion, if other scientists don't speak up and say, no, it doesn't, that's a mistake, that's a misunderstanding of theology and philosophy and so forth, it's just an extrapolation, an improper extrapolation of science, as if science gave you all the answers that there are in life, that's incorrect. So it's important for people, I think, like me or like others in science to speak up and say, no, I don't believe that that's true. And here are the reasons. The main reason that I would argue to discount the claims of the anti-theists is that they're basically extrapolating science's success into a claim or a belief that science is all the real knowledge there is. This is the mispractice of scientism. So that there are scientific claims made that somehow science governs all kinds of other thinking and disciplines, and there's no way to get to know anything other than through science. But that's a ghastly intellectual mistake. It's an intellectual mistake often made by high-profile anti-theistic scientists. But it's important for folks like me to speak up. I don't think that I have any particular authority in theology or anything else. I'm certainly not an expert in all of these areas. But I do think it's helpful for people who live in our society where science has such a high profile to know that there are people who are serious scientists who have standing, who have thought about the question and have not found the contradictions to be the way that the anti-theists have claimed.
Right. Amen. Amen to all of that. And so for you personally, as a scientist and working on some very important things, as you said, that's why we're here at Purpose Nation, is we want to encourage folks to support scientists like you and your work. Very important work. There's so many things that can come out of it in terms of medical discoveries and technologies and energy and all of these things. So we definitely want Christians to not only support it, but potentially get into these fields themselves. For you personally, how has your Christian faith reinforced your work, and vice versa? How would you describe the interplay between your faith and your work?
Well, there is a sense in which some of the motivations for the things I actually study spring out of my sense of compassion and duty towards the people who are in trouble or in terms of making people's lives better. But I would also point to the fact that science is not just, what you learn in science lectures. So a practicing scientist who is going to be successful draws upon all kinds of other skills and aspects of their character. So if you're in leadership of a big group, as I was for a substantial part of my career, dealing with people, individuals, personal interactions, building teamwork, speaking to funding agencies and so forth about the value of our work. All of these are things which go far beyond what one learns in technical lectures. And so being a scientist is far more than just what do you know and what have you learned and what equations can you solve. I would certainly say that some of the things that have stood me in good stead in some of these leadership and teamwork roles have been things that I've learned much more from my Christian life and my Christian fellowships and churches than I have from, the lectures or studies that I've conducted in universities. So scientists are whole people, and they benefit from the strengths that come from being a follower of Jesus just the same as everyone else does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, amen. That's a great point. Just sort of the personal interaction and the skills you learn, and kind of the parables and the teachings of our faith as well can help folks in any field that they're in. And so if somebody's maybe it's a parent with a young person, or it's a young person that's in the audience, and they kind of feel somewhat scientifically minded, and they like building things, or they like just learning about physics or other types of science, and what would you say to them to encourage them to potentially pray about a calling in one of these fields?
Well, first thing to say is that it's not the case that you can't be a scientist and a Christian. They are not incompatible. They're perfectly compatible, and that's been my experience through my life. But of course, the other thing is, if you're drawn to and interested in things of nature, and if you like to tinker with stuff, as I did when I was a kid, all kinds of crazy things I did. Looking back, I shudder, but, don't be discouraged by that. Be encouraged. And science does call for a level of dedication, study, seriousness, because science isn't just sloppy. In science, we find out quite quickly when things are true and when things are false. And so it's naturally a rigorous study, but it's one that's enormously rewarding. I've certainly derived great pleasure and enjoyed deeply discovering about the way that God has created the world. And I certainly see that as part, in a certain sense, of my Christian calling. And I'm happy to be doing it. And I do it as best I can, in a certain sense, as to the Lord.
Amen. Thank you. And we've been having a delightful conversation with Professor Ian Hutchinson. Again, he's got a great book out, definitely a useful resource for Christians and non-Christians alike to some of these very important questions. And he's answered many of them in this book and gone through and just really put them together very nicely and organized them well. And it's a great resource for you and your church and interacting with people. And again, it's called Can a Scientist Believe in Miracles? An MIT professor answers questions on God and science. So you mentioned the chorus concert coming up. Anything else? Squash tournaments? Any fly fishing hikes this summer? What do you have coming up?
I'm going to take some time off this summer and relax. I'm going to go to see my mother-in-law's 90th birthday in Australia, and that'll be my biggest adventure. Good.
Well, God bless you and your work and your travels this summer to Australia and beyond. And just thank you so much for being on the podcast with us today.
You're very welcome. It's been a pleasure being with you.
Professor Hutchinson, thank you so much, and God bless you.
Thank you for joining the Purpose Nation podcast. For more great interviews, resources, or to make your tax-deductible contribution to support our nonprofit ministry, please visit purposenation.org. This program is copyright Purpose Nation, Inc., a 501c3 nonprofit corporation.